Daniel, welcome to our show. So the Supreme Court has agreed now to hear these cases that all involve matters of conscience, and the Little Sisters of the Poor case, I guess, is the one that's gotten the most publicity. How has the Little Sisters case done in the appellate courts? How have the courts been ruling?
Well, the courts overwhelmingly, just counting the pure number of rulings from courts of the district court, appellate court, and the Supreme Court, the courts have overwhelmingly been rejecting the government's arguments and protecting religious conscience. Unfortunately, several appellate courts got it wrong, and the Tenth Circuit, the court that ruled in the Little Sisters case, was one of those courts that got it wrong, which is why the sisters had to go back to the Supreme Court again to get protection from the government scheme to force them to provide and participate in providing contraceptive services to their employees.
Mm-hmm. On what basis is the court saying that the Little Sisters is not a religious organization?
Well, it's not that they're not saying that the sisters aren't religious. They're saying that the government is allowed to determine that the Little Sisters aren't religious enough, right? So the government has set up a scheme that says churches don't have to participate in providing these drugs to their employees. Churches are religious enough. And other ministries that are closely associated with the churches, they're also religious enough. But the Little Sisters of the Poor, the government says, you're not religious enough. And unfortunately, a few courts have said that's okay. The government gets to do that kind of religious discrimination. Now, the question before the Supreme Court is whether the government's permitted to force the sisters to do something that it knows is a religious problem, right? That's why it exempted the churches in the first place. But it gets to force the sisters to do that, even though it has other ways of accomplishing its mission without forcing the sisters to be involved.
Some of the courts have saying that the sisters have a way to opt out of this, that there's an accommodation that the government has in there for them. What is the sisters' objection to that?
That is not an accommodation scheme. That is a capture scheme. The sisters are being forced to allow the government to take over their health care plan. That's what we're talking about here. It's the exact same issue in many respects as was the Supreme Court already decided in the Hobby Lobby case. There, the government said, we want to force you to allow us to take over your health care plan to provide these drugs. Now, there were some nuances, but at the end of the day, the religious objection to both is pretty much the same. The ministries are saying, we can't be involved in your scheme to take over our plans and use those plans to deliver these drugs. We built those plans and we sustain them every day. So you're asking us to basically sign a permission slip that takes the thing that we built to do good stuff and make it do bad stuff. And then you're forcing us to be constantly involved in doing the bad thing that our faith says we can't do. So the sisters, they're not saying the government can't do this. They're just saying, please don't force us to do this. And that's what the government's insisting it should be able to do.
Yeah. Is the fact that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear this case and others similar, is that an indication of which way this case is going to go?
You know, there are some good signs that suggest the court takes this very seriously and doesn't accept the government's arguments. It's already ruled against the government's arguments in the Hobby Lobby case. The Little Sisters are coming back to the Supreme Court. They got emergency relief at the last second back in 2014. And the court said, this is emergency protection that you'll have for a little while and then you can come back and we'll talk about it again. Well, the sisters are back again. And the court has, since that time, between the Little Sisters and Hobby Lobby and now, it's also provided some other emergency protection for other ministries in very similar cases. So the court has been taking these cases very seriously, and it has not been buying the government's arguments, which are very similar to the arguments that I'll be making in front of the court here very soon.
What happens if the Little Sisters lose this case before the Supreme Court? Would they go out of business, all the good works that they do?
Listen, the Little Sisters know two things for certain. They have been ministering to the elderly poor for 175 years, and they minister because of their faith. And they're not going to leave their faith behind, and they're not going to leave the elderly poor behind. How exactly they're going to be able to afford $70 million in annual fines is anyone's guess. And one would hope that day never comes, the day when our own government says to nuns who minister to the elderly poor, choose between your faith and your ability to minister in the way that you always have. And so we're hopeful that doesn't happen. And It would be wrong if it did.
Sure. What's the timeline on this? Do you have any idea when these arguments would be heard before the court?
The court has indicated that it expects to hold arguments in March.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. We'll be watching, and I'm sure we'll be getting back to the Becket Fund.